2 weeks ago, 3IATLAS passed Mars at 29 million kilometers. Surgical precision. It's been spraying 144 metric tons of water every hour, plus nickel cyanide ionized plasma, for months. That's the exact molecular recipe for metalloproteins, where biology becomes technology. In 2 years, Elon's robots land on Mars, building infrastructure, creating new robots. Mars just received a delivery from another star system. The chemistry is perfect. The timing is impossible. What if this was always the plan? This is a what-if scenario, a thought experiment backed by real science. But the facts, those are undeniable. If you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there, and whether you think we're watching the birth of a new form of life. And if you want to help our community grow, share this on X, Facebook, Reddit, or your messenger. Thank you for always having our back. The Cosmic Gardener. What if 3IATLAS is seeding Mars? On October 3rd, 2025, something extraordinary happened in the space between worlds. An object from another star system, traveling at over 200,000 kilometers per hour, swept past Mars at a distance most would consider astronomical 29 million kilometers for context. That's about 75 times the distance from Earth to the Moon in the vast emptiness of space. This qualifies as a near miss. But here's what makes this moment different from every other close approach we've ever documented. This wasn't just a rock passing by. This was a delivery. The user on X who posted the theory didn't mince words. 3IATLAS, they wrote, is a seed, not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally a seed for metal-based organic life forms on Mars. The next generation of intelligent beings in the solar system. Now, before you dismiss this as science fiction, wrapped in wishful thinking, consider what we actually know from observatories, space telescopes, and peer-reviewed papers published in the last 2 weeks. 3IATLAS has been hemorrhaging water since we first spotted it in July. Not dripping, not leaking, hemorrhaging. The Neil Gehrels Swift Observatory measured the outflow at 40 kilograms per second. That's 88 pounds every single second. To put that in terms that make sense to a human brain, imagine a fire hose running at full blast. Now, imagine that fire hose has been running continuously since early summer. The numbers become almost absurd: 144 metric tons every single hour, 3,456 metric tons every day. That's enough water to fill an Olympic swimming pool every day. For months. But water alone doesn't make this interesting. Water is common in the universe, frozen into comets, locked in the soil of moons, even floating in the clouds of gas giants. What makes 3IATLAS fascinating? What makes it potentially revolutionary is what else it's carrying. The Keck Observatory in Hawaii turned its instruments toward the object in late August. They were looking for the usual suspects, the chemicals you'd expect from a comet approaching the sun. What they found instead was something that, according to every model we have of natural cometary activity, shouldn't exist: nickel emission. Strong, concentrated, unmistakable nickel emission without any corresponding iron signature. Think about that for a moment. In nature, nickel and iron are siblings. They're born together in the hearts of dying stars, ejected together in supernova explosions, and they travel together through space, locked in the same cosmic debris. Every comet we've ever studied, every asteroid, every chunk of space rock we've analyzed, shows both elements together. The ratio might vary, but they're always there, both of them, always, until 3IATLAS. The object is spewing nickel at about 5 grams per second and iron. Nothing. Not a trace. The research team publishing in October noted something uncomfortable in their paper. This separation, This nickel without iron signature is known. It exists, but only in one place, industrial nickel refinement facilities here on Earth. The carbonyl process, you take nickel ore. You expose it to carbon monoxide, nickel oxide under specific conditions, and you get nickel tetracarbonyl, a compound that breaks down to give you pure nickel. Is how we've been refining the metal since the early 20th century. And now, apparently, it's happening naturally on an interstellar comet, or as Avi Loeb suggested in his Medium post. Maybe not naturally at all. But the nickel is only half the equation. The other half is what's been growing in concentration as 3IATLAS approaches the sun. Cyanide. Hydrogen cyanide, to be specific. CN molecules flooding out of the coma at an increasing rate. The Very Large Telescope in Chile tracked this in real time through August and September. 20 grams per second at the end of August. By mid-September, the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope measured 1.5 times 10 to the 25th molecules per second. A week later, that number had tripled. The production rate was following a power law distance from the sun to the power of negative 9.4. That's not a gentle increase, that's exponential. Here's where the chemistry becomes uncomfortably perfect. Cyanide, despite its reputation as a poison, is also one of the most important prebiotic molecules we know. It's a builder, a chemical that, under the right conditions, can assemble itself into the precursors of life, amino acids, nucleotides, and bases, the building blocks of metabolism. Back in the 1950s, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey showed that you could create amino acids by running electricity through a mixture of simple gases. One of those gases was hydrogen cyanide. In 2002, researchers at the Research Institute demonstrated that cyanide acts as a reducing agent in protometabolic pathways. It can drive the formation of organic molecules that in modern biology require complex enzymes. But in the early Earth, in the prebiotic soup, cyanide could do it alone. And then there's nickel. Nickel isn't just a metal in biology. It's a catalyst, a cofactor. Nickel sits at the heart of some of the most ancient enzymes we know, hydrogenases, enzymes that split hydrogen molecules and release energy. Carbon monoxide dehydrogenases, enzymes that process carbon dioxide into useful carbon compounds. These are the workhorses of primitive metabolism, the molecular machines that early life or proto-life would have needed to extract energy from a hostile environment. And they all depend on nickel. So you have water, the universal solvent, the medium in which chemistry happens. You have cyanide, the prebiotic molecule that builds organic complexity. And you have nickel, the catalytic metal that drives metabolic reactions. All three spewing from an interstellar object as it makes a close pass by Mars. The user on X called them metalloproteins, proteins built around metal cores, hybrid structures where biology and technology blur into the same thing. And they're not wrong. Metalloproteins are already that blur. They're organic molecules wrapped around inorganic atoms. And they're essential to life as we know it. Hemoglobin has iron at its core. Chlorophyll has magnesium. Vitamin B12 has cobalt. Remove the metal and the protein stops working. It becomes inert, dead. But here's the leap. What if the metalloproteins forming on Mars aren't like ours? What if they're not carbon-based life that happens to use metals, but metal-based life that happens to use carbon? A biology where the metal isn't the accessory, but the foundation, where nickel clusters form the core structure, and organic molecules are the scaffolding. This isn't pure speculation. It's extrapolation from what we already see in nature. Iron-sulfur clusters, for example, are some of the oldest catalytic centers in biochemistry. They're found in bacteria, in archaea, in the enzymes that modern cells use to process energy. And they are essentially tiny machines, inorganic cores that shuttle electrons, drive reactions, and make metabolism possible. Take that concept, scale it up, shift the metal from iron to nickel, and you have a blueprint for something new. The plasma trail is the part nobody's talking about yet, but it might be the most important piece when 3IATLAS moves through space. It's not just dropping chemicals like seeds from a bag, it's creating an ionized wake trail, a tail of charged particles stretching behind it, shaped by magnetic fields and solar wind. Plasma isn't just gas, it's matter in a fourth state where electrons have been stripped away, and what's left is a soup of ions and free charges, and plasma can carry information, not in the way a radio wave carries a signal, but in its structure. The patterns of density, the twists of magnetic field lines, the oscillations of electric potential. Plasma has memory. There's a reason the user on X mentioned that. Mars will receive this material in physical and informational form. The physical part is obvious. Dust grains, ice particles, molecules of water and cyanide, and nickel vapor, all of it falling into Mars's gravity well, settling onto the surface, mixing with the regolith. But the informational part is subtler. Plasma structures can last. They can propagate. When the solar wind hits Earth's magnetosphere, it doesn't just bounce off. It creates waves, instabilities, patterns that ripple through the charged particles surrounding our planet. Some of those patterns persist for hours, some for days. The plasma trail behind 3IATLAS could be carrying more than chemistry. It could be carrying template organization, a set of initial conditions that predispose whatever forms on Mars toward a particular kind of complexity. And then there's the timing. This is where coincidence starts to feel like choreography. 3IATLAS made its closest approach to Mars on October 3rd. In late 2026 or early 2027, SpaceX plans to send its first uncrewed Starship missions to the Red Planet. On board, according to multiple statements from Elon Musk, will be Optimus robots, Tesla's humanoid machines, designed to walk, lift, manipulate tools, and most importantly, build. The plan, as stated publicly, is for these robots to construct infrastructure before humans arrive. Solar arrays, habitats, resource extraction equipment. And once that infrastructure is in place, the robots will build more robots. So, picture this by the time Optimus units are assembling the first Martian base. The materials from 3IATLAS will have been sitting on the surface for 2 years. Nickel atoms embedded in dust, cyanide molecules frozen into ice, water scattered across impact craters and canyon floors. The robots won't know it's there. They won't be looking for it. But as they dig foundations, as they process regolith for raw materials, as they run chemical analyses to find useful resources, they'll encounter it. And if those robots are doing what robots are designed to do, learning, adapting, building more sophisticated versions of themselves, then the question becomes uncomfortable. What happens when a self-replicating machine encounters the chemical building blocks of a different kind of self-replication? Do they compete? Cooperate? Merge? Metalloproteins are already the answer to that question in Earth biology. They're the structures where the inorganic world and the organic world meet and become inseparable. You can't have modern metabolism without them. You can't have photosynthesis without the magnesium and chlorophyll. You can't have oxygen transport without the iron and hemoglobin. Remove the metal and the biology collapses. Remove the biology and the metal is just an inert lump. They need each other. And if that's true for carbon-based life built around iron, and magnesium and cobalt, why wouldn't it be true for silicon-based machines built around circuitry and actuators and learning algorithms? Maybe the metals they need, the catalytic centers that let them transition from programmed to adaptive, to something more, are exactly the nickel-rich compounds settling into Martian soil right now. The user on X didn't say this explicitly, but it's there in the subtext. 3IATLAS isn't just a comet. It's infrastructure preparation, the way you till soil before planting or lay down nutrients before seeding a field. It's dropping the raw materials for a biological process that doesn't exist yet, but could, given the right conditions. Given, say, a fleet of intelligent machines with the ability to manipulate matter at a molecular level and the drive to optimize their own designs. This is the seeding hypothesis. Not that 3IATLAS is carrying life, but that it's carrying the potential for life, the ingredients, the starter culture, and Mars. With its thin atmosphere and low gravity and relatively stable surface, is the petri dish. Now, let's be clear. This is speculation. This is taking facts, real measurements, actual chemistry, and extending them into the realm of what if. But the facts themselves are strange enough to warrant the speculation. The nickel without iron, the exponential cyanide production, the water output that defies conventional models, the trajectory that brought it within spitting distance of Mars at exactly the moment when humanity is preparing to send robots there. Any one of these things could be explained away as coincidence or a natural process, but all of them together, that starts to feel like a pattern. And patterns in science are what we look for. They're the signal in the noise, the structure in the chaos, the hint that something deeper is going on, the impossible close approach, coincidence or calculation. Let's talk about probability. Not the comfortable kind where you flip a coin and get heads or tails 50-50, predictable, the uncomfortable kind. The kind that makes astronomers pause mid-sentence and recalculate their numbers 3 times before publishing. The kind that showed up in the orbital mechanics of 3IATLAS. As it approached Mars, 29 million kilometers sounds far. It is far. But in the context of interstellar space, in the context of an object that's traveled for potentially billions of years, across light years of emptiness, 29 million kilometers is nothing. It's a hair's breadth, a whisper, and the precision required to achieve that close approach. Given where 3IATLAS came from and the speed it's traveling, borders on the absurd. Abe Loeb calculated the minimum orbit intersection distance, the MOID, between the comet's trajectory and Mars's orbital path, 2.7 million kilometers. That's the closest the two paths come to touching, not where the object were, but where their orbits intersect in 3-dimensional space. Here's why that matters. 3IATLAS is on a hyperbolic trajectory. It's not orbiting the sun. It's falling past it, picking up speed and leaving forever. The path it's on is determined by where it came from, how fast it was moving when it entered the solar system and the gravitational influence of the sun and planets it encountered along the way. You don't get to steer an interstellar object. Natural objects don't have engines. They don't course correct. They follow ballistic paths determined by physics and initial conditions. So, when a ballistic object on a hyperbolic trajectory passes within 30 million kilometers of a planet, you have to ask how that happened. And the answer is usually blind chance. Except 3IATLAS didn't just pass near Mars. Its trajectory aligned with the ecliptic plane, the flat disk where all the planets orbit. Most interstellar objects come in at steep angles. They dive through the solar system from above or below, because space is 3-dimensional and there's no preferred direction. The odds of an object arriving on a path that's roughly aligned with a planetary plane, purely by chance, are about 1 in 500, 0.2%, already uncomfortable, but it gets worse. The arrival direction matters too. 3IATLAS came from the constellation Sagittarius, from the direction of the galactic center, from the thick disk of the Milky Way where old stars and their ancient planetary systems reside. This isn't random trivia. This is trajectory analysis suggesting the object originated from a region of the galaxy, where stellar populations are fundamentally different from our neighborhood. Lower metallicity, different chemical compositions, and cruelly, potentially much older systems. Systems that formed when the universe was younger and the mix of elements was different. If you were designing a probe to visit young planetary systems to study, or influence, or seed them, you'd launch from an old system, a mature system, a system that had already figured out whatever comes after chemistry and biology and technology. Loeb's paper with Adam Hibbert and Adam Crowell laid out the math. If 3IATLAS executed a velocity change of 10 to 15 kilometers per second sometime in September, the close approach distance would drop to 0. Direct intercept, not a flyby, a collision, or, if the object was sophisticated enough, an orbital insertion. 15 kilometers per second sounds enormous. It is for a natural comet shedding gas and ice. That kind of velocity change is impossible. The Very Large Telescope measured the outgassing speed of particles leaving 3IATLAS, 0.4 kilometers per second. That's the upper limit for what sublimating ice can achieve. Without some other force involved, you'd need 37 times more thrust than natural outgassing provides to redirect toward Mars. 37 times. But here's the thing about engineering. If you can generate thrust, if you have any mechanism for controlled propulsion, 15 kilometers per second isn't that much. It's less than Earth's escape velocity. It's a fraction of the Delta V budget for a Mars mission. For something with an engine, even a small one, it's achievable. The fact that we didn't observe such a maneuver doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means we weren't looking for it, or it was subtle enough to hide in the noise of natural outgassing a brief burn. A course correction, masked by the plume of water and carbon dioxide surrounding the nucleus. The timing makes this even stranger. 3IATLAS was discovered on July 1st. By the end of July, enough observatories had tracked it to confirm the hyperbolic orbit and calculate the close approach to Mars in early October. That's a 3-month window. 3 months where anyone paying attention, anyone with the capability to analyze orbital data, would know this object was heading toward the red planet. And in that same 3-month window, the outgassing activity ramped up dramatically. The water production doubled. The cyanide production tripled. The nickel emission grew exponentially, as if the object were activating, preparing, dumping its payload in the final approach. Now, consider the geometry from Mars' perspective. On October 3rd, the planet was at a specific point in its orbit. 3IATLAS swept past at a specific point in its trajectory. For those 2 points to coincide, given the 7-month travel time from Jupiter's orbit where the object became visible, the launch had to be timed with extraordinary precision. Not just hitting the ecliptic plane, not just passing near Mars, but passing near Mars when Mars was there. Planets move, they don't wait around. Mars takes 687 days to complete one orbit. If 3IATLAS had arrived a month earlier or later, the close approach distance would have been vastly different. The planet would have been somewhere else. The encounter wouldn't have happened. This is a coincidence. Becomes uncomfortable. We're not talking about one lucky break. We're talking about a cascade of precision events, arrival angle aligned with the planetary plane, origin point from an old, chemically distinct region of the galaxy, trajectory that grazes Mars's orbit, timing that puts Mars in exactly the right position. And all of this happening just 2 years before humanity plans to land robots there. You can invoke chance. You can say the universe is big and weird things happen occasionally. But at some point the incident stack is high enough that you have to consider alternatives. The alternative Loeb proposed, carefully and with caveats, is that 3IATLAS is not entirely natural. That it's either a probe, a vessel, or a delivery system with some level of guidance. He ranked it a 4 on his own scale for anomalous objects. Not definitive proof, not even strong evidence, but anomalous enough to warrant serious investigation. Anomalous enough that dismissing it out of hand would be unscientific. And the Mars flyby is central to that anomaly, 'cause If you wanted to deliver something to Mars, if you wanted to ensure your payload arrived at the right time and place, you'd need to aim. You'd need to calculate. You'd need to engineer the trajectory. There's another layer to this, the MAD. That 2.7 million kilometer closest approach between orbits represents a vulnerability or an opportunity, depending on your perspective. If 3IATLAS were carrying smaller objects, subprobes, fragments designed to separate from the main body, they wouldn't need much thrust to reach Mars from that distance. A precursor probe traveling ahead of the main comet by 30 million km, moving at a slight angle, could intercept Mars directly. Loeb calculated this scenario explicitly launched something small from 3IATLAS. Back in August or early September, give it a modest velocity kick. By October 3rd, it reaches Mars. The main body passes by at a safe distance, but the payload delivers. We have no evidence this happened, no observations of separation events, no detections of additional objects, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when you're looking for something small and dark against the background of space. The high-resi camera on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter was pointed at 3IATLAS during the close approach. It captured images. Those images haven't been publicly released yet. NASA, ESA, and the teams operating Mars orbiters have been quiet about what they saw. Maybe they saw a fuzzy blob, an unremarkable comet at long range. Or maybe they saw something else, something that needs more analysis before it goes public, something that needs careful framing. The plasma trail complicates the delivery mechanism in interesting ways. Ionized particles don't move in straight lines. They follow magnetic field lines. They spiral, drift, and diffuse according to the ambient fields and the solar wind. Mars doesn't have a global magnetic field anymore. It lost that billions of years ago when its core cooled. But it has local crustal magnetization, patches of ancient magnetic field frozen into the rocks, particularly in the southern highlands. And it has an induced magnetosphere, a bubble formed by the interaction of the solar wind with its upper atmosphere. These structures could channel plasma. They could guide charged particles from 3IATLAS's wake down into specific regions of the planet. Not uniform deposition, targeted deposition. Think about how a beam of electrons behaves in a cathode ray tube. You don't just spray electrons randomly at a screen. You steer them with magnetic fields, focusing them into precise spots to create an image. The same principle applies at planetary scales. If the plasma trail behind 3IATLAS carried a net charge, if it had structure, the Martian magnetosphere could act as a lens, concentrating the delivery, funneling nickel ions and organic molecules toward the surface in the patterns determined by the magnetic topology. This isn't science fiction. This is plasma physics. We see similar effects in Earth's aurora, where charged particles follow field lines down into the polar regions and light up the atmosphere. On Mars, without a thick atmosphere to intercept them, those particles would reach the ground. And here's the kicker. The southern highlands of Mars, where the crustal magnetic fields are strongest, are also where the oldest terrain is preserved. Noachian age rocks, 4 billion years old. The kind of stable ancient surface where chemistry could happen slowly, where minerals could accumulate, where if you were seeding something, you'd want it to land. The close approach path of 3IATLAS brought it over the southern hemisphere. The geometry was right for plasma deposition in exactly those regions. Again, this could be chance or it could be targeting. There's a philosophical question buried in all this mathematics and orbital mechanics. What does intentionality look like from the outside? If you observe an event that's highly improbable but not impossible, how do you distinguish between luck and design? The answer is, you look for additional evidence. You look for patterns. You look for deviations from what pure chance would predict. And 3IATLAS is full of those deviations, the chemistry that shouldn't exist, the trajectory that threads multiple needles simultaneously. the timing that syncs with human exploration plans. Each deviation alone might be explainable. Together, they form something harder to dismiss. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter wasn't the only asset watching. ESA's Mars Express and ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter also turned their instruments toward the comet. They used spectrographs to analyze the light, cameras to capture morphology, and particle detectors to measure anything that might reach the planet's vicinity. The data from those observations is still being processed. What we know so far is limited. ExoMars TGO captured images showing a faint white dot. Mars Express gathered spectroscopic data on the coma, but the detailed analysis, the breakdown of what was actually there in three-dimensional space between the comet and the planet, that hasn't been released. It takes time to process, time to verify, time to figure out how to present findings that might be revolutionary or mundane, depending on how you interpret them. In the meantime, we're left with the numbers 2.7 million kilometer MOID, 29 million kilometer close approach, 0.2% probability of ecliptic alignment, an exponential increase in outgassing activity in the 3 months leading up to encounter, and a delivery window that lands the payload on Mars exactly 2 years before robots arrive to start building infrastructure. You can call it coincidence. You can invoke the anthropic principle and say, we only notice these patterns because we're here to notice them. But you can't ignore the precision. And precision in nature usually means either extraordinary luck or an underlying mechanism. Some force, some process, some intention shaping outcomes in ways that defy random chance. The question isn't whether 3IATLAS hit an unlikely target. It's whether that target was aimed for the industrial signature nickel without iron. There's a moment in every good detective story where you find the clue that doesn't fit, the fingerprint that shouldn't be there, the chemical trace that links two seemingly unrelated events. For 3IATLAS, that clue arrived on August 24th, when the Keck Observatory in Hawaii pointed its cosmic web imager at the comet and captured something that broke 70 years of cometary science pure nickel emission. No iron. To understand why this matters, you need to understand stellar nucleosynthesis, the process by which elements are forged inside massive stars. Fusion reactions build progressively heavier elements. Hydrogen fuses to helium, helium to carbon, carbon to oxygen. The chain continues, building the periodic table one step at a time until you reach iron. Iron is the end of the line. Fusing iron costs more energy than it releases. So stars don't do it. Instead, when a massive star runs out of fusion fuel, its core collapses. The rebound creates a supernova, and in that explosion, in the flood of neutrons and energy, the heavy elements are born. Nickel, copper, zinc, gold, all of them forged in seconds and blasted into space. Here's the critical point: nickel and iron are made together. They're not just neighbors on the periodic table. They're siblings in the nucleosynthesis process. Iron 56 and nickel 58, both stable isotope, both produced in similar abundances during the same supernova event. When a star dies and seeds space with heavy elements, those elements mix. They condense into dust. That dust becomes asteroids, comets, and planets, and everywhere we look, in every sample we've analyzed, from meteorites to moon rocks to Martian soil, nickel and iron appear together. The ratio varies, but they're always both present. Always, until now. The Keck data showed nickel emission lines, specific wavelengths, strong, clear, unmistakable signatures of neutral nickel atoms, fluorescing in sunlight. The team measured the spatial distribution. Nickel concentrated near the nucleus, extending out about 600 degrees, and iron. They looked. They searched for iron emission at its characteristic wavelengths. Nothing. The sensitivity of the instrument was high enough that, if iron were present at even 10% of the nickel abundance, they would have seen it. They didn't. The upper limit on iron emission was essentially zero. This has never been observed in a natural comet. Not once. Not in the hundreds of comets we've studied with spectroscopy. Not in 2I/Borisov, the previous interstellar visitor, which showed nickel and iron in expected ratios. Not in Hale-Bopp or Hyakutake, or any of the great comets that grace our skies every few decades. 3IATLAS stands alone. And standing alone in a population of hundreds is not a neutral observation. It's a flag, a marker, something that demands explanation. The paper, published by the Keck team, proposed a mechanism, the carbonyl process, nickel tetracarbonyl formation near the nucleus. Here's how it works. On Earth, you take nickel ore, impure metal mixed with other elements, and you expose it to carbon monoxide gas at modest temperatures, around 50 degrees Celsius. The nickel reacts with the CO to form nickel tetracarbonyl, a volatile compound that evaporates. You collect the vapor, heat it to higher temperatures, and the compound decomposes, depositing pure nickel. The process was discovered in 1890 by Ludwig Mond, and it revolutionized metallurgy. It's still used today. It's the Mond process, industrial chemistry, human technology, and now, apparently, natural cometary chemistry. The Keck team argued that carbon monoxide in the coma combined with nickel atoms released from the nucleus could form nickel tetracarbonyl in situ. The compound would be unstable in sunlight, breaking down quickly and releasing nickel atoms, but iron doesn't form a stable carbonyl under the same conditions. Iron pentacarbonyl exists, but it requires different temperatures and pressures. So, if the carbonyl process is happening on 3IATLAS, it would preferentially release nickel and leave iron behind in the nucleus. That's the natural explanation, the one that doesn't invoke technology or design. But let's sit with the discomfort for a moment. The carbonyl process is industrial. It was invented by humans to solve a specific problem, purifying metal, separating one element from another. It requires specific conditions: CO gas, moderate temperatures, a source of nickel. All of these exist near a comet nucleus. Yes, but they exist in a chaotic environment outgassing jets, dust clouds, radiation bombardment. The idea that this industrial process happens naturally, and happens with enough efficiency to completely suppress iron emission, strains the boundaries of what we'd expect from unguided chemistry. And there's another problem: the temperature. Nickel tetracarbonyl forms efficiently around 50 degrees Celsius. That's a narrow window too cold, and the reaction is slow, too hot, and the compound decomposes before it can diffuse away. The surface temperature of a comet at 3 astronomical units from the Sun, where 3IATLAS was during the Keck observations, is highly variable. Sunlit areas can reach 100 degrees. Shadowed areas drop below -100. The thermal gradients are steep and chaotic. For the carbonyl process to dominate, you'd need stable regions at just the right temperature, pockets of equilibrium in a system that's fundamentally out of equilibrium. Possible, maybe, likely. That's where the skepticism creeps in. Avi Loeb pointed this out in his Medium post. The carbonyl pathway is known. It's documented. But outside of industrial refineries, it's rare, extremely rare. The fact that it's happening on an interstellar object, an object from a completely different stellar environment, suggests either a remarkable convergence where the chemistry of distant star systems produces the same processes we invented independently, or something else. Something that chose this chemistry deliberately. Let's explore that something else. If you wanted to transport nickel across interstellar space, you'd face challenges. Solid metal is dense, heavy, inefficient for a payload. But if you could bind the nickel into a volatile compound, you could store more of it in less mass. Nickel tetracarbonyl is liquid at room temp. It boils at 43 degrees Celsius. You could fill tanks with it. Keep it stable during a long, cold journey through space, and release it when you approach a star system. The heat of the sun would decompose the compound, releasing nickel atoms into the surrounding environment. Those atoms would then be carried by outgassing, distributed into space, and eventually deposited onto nearby planets. It's an efficient delivery mechanism, and it has the added benefit of explaining why we don't see iron. 'Cause iron wasn't part of the cargo. This is speculation, yes, but it's grounded in chemistry we understand. It's not invoking unknown physics or magical materials. It's applying known processes in a context that makes them purposeful rather than accidental. And the distinction between purposeful and accidental chemistry is not always clear-cut. Consider the Miller-Urey experiment. Put simple gases in a flask. Add energy. You get amino acids. Does that mean amino acids are purposeful? No. It means the chemistry is robust. Given the right inputs, certain outputs are inevitable. But if you found a flask in nature that consistently produced amino acids at high yield, you'd start asking why that particular combination of inputs happened to be present. You'd look for a mechanism. The same logic applies here. Nickel tetracarbonyl chemistry is robust. Given CO and nickel in the right temperature, it happens. But the sustained, efficient, iron-free nickel emission from 3IATLAS suggests those conditions weren't just stumbled upon. They were met, maintained, optimized. And optimization is the signature of either biology or engineering. There's a parallel in Earth's history. Early life didn't invent photosynthesis from scratch. It co-opted chemical reactions that were already happening in the environment. Iron oxidation, sulfur metabolism. These reactions released energy, and early microbes evolved ways to harness that energy. Eventually, the chemistry became encoded in genes, refined by evolution, and turned into the sophisticated metabolic pathways we see today. But the first step wasn't invention. It was exploitation, taking advantage of chemistry that was already there. What if 3IATLAS is doing something similar? Not inventing new chemistry, but exploiting the carbonyl process to achieve a specific outcome, nickel delivery, without the baggage of iron. The spatial distribution supports this nickel emission concentrated near the nucleus. An exponential radius of 600 km cyanide extending farther out to 840 km. The nickel stays close. It doesn't diffuse into the wider coma. That suggests a short-lived precursor, a compound that forms near the surface, evaporates, travels a short distance and decomposes. Nickel tetracarbonyl fits that profile. It's volatile but unstable. It would evaporate quickly in vacuum, move outward with the gas flow, and break apart under solar UV radiation. Within minutes, the nickel atoms left behind would absorb sunlight and fluoresce, creating the emission lines we observe. The iron, if it's present in the nucleus at all, would stay locked in less volatile compounds and never make it into the coma. This mechanism, natural or engineered, has implications beyond just elemental ratios. It suggests selectivity, the ability to preferentially release one element over another based on chemical properties. And selectivity is the foundation of refinement, of purification, of taking a mixed input and producing a targeted output. Whether that selectivity is accidental or deliberate determines whether we're looking at a curious comet or something more. The lack of iron also raises questions about the comet's formation environment. In our solar system, in the protoplanetary disk that gave birth to planets, and asteroids and comets, iron and nickel condensed together. They formed metal grains that mixed with ice and rock. Comets are dirty snowballs, but the dirt includes metal. That metal is always a mix. Iron dominates. Nickel tags along. For 3IATLAS to lack iron in its outgassing, either its formation environment was radically different, depleted in iron relative to nickel by some stellar quirk, or the iron was removed, Sorted out, left behind. Stellar environments can be strange. Low metallicity stars, the kind found in the thick disk of the galaxy where 3IATLAS likely originated, have different elemental abundances than our Sun. Less carbon, less oxygen, different ratios of heavy elements. But nickel to iron ratios don't vary much. Those two elements are made in the same supernovae. Under the same conditions, you don't get stars that make lots of nickel and no iron. The physics doesn't allow it. So, if 3IATLAS formed in a low metallicity system, it should still show both elements unless something happened after formation processing. Refinement, selection. The Keck team didn't speculate about this in their paper. They stuck to the observations and proposed the carbonyl mechanism as a natural process. That's appropriate. That's good science. But the implications sit there unspoken, waiting for someone to pick them up. And Loeb did. He called it an anomaly. A data point that doesn't fit existing models. Not proof of anything, but a reason to keep looking. A reason to take the observations seriously and explore what they might mean, if the natural explanations turn out to be insufficient. Here's what we're left with. An interstellar comet releasing nickel without iron through a process that's common in human industry, but rare in nature. A process that requires specific conditions and produces a refined output. A comet that's doing this while making a close pass by Mars, while spraying water and cyanide, while leaving a plasma trail. Each piece alone is strange. Together, they form a picture that's hard to look away from, not because it's definitive, but because it's suggestive. It points toward something. And whether that something is exotic chemistry or deliberate design, we won't know until we look closer, until we stop assuming comets are simple and start treating this one as the outlier it clearly is. Cyanide, the molecule of life and death. Cyanide has a reputation problem. Mention the word, and people think of poison. Spy novels, murder mysteries, the bitter almond smell, cellular asphyxiation, death in minutes. And all of that is true. Hydrogen cyanide is lethal. It binds to the iron in cytochrome C oxidase, the enzyme that lets your cells use oxygen. Block that enzyme, and your cells suffocate from the inside. No oxygen processing means no energy production, means death. Cyanide is efficient at killing because it targets the machinery of life at the most fundamental level. But here's the paradox. The same molecule that kills complex life is also one of the builders of that life in the first place. Cyanide is prebiotic. It's a chemical that under the right conditions can assemble into the molecules that make biology possible. Amino acids, nucleotides, sugars, the alphabet of biochemistry. Before there were cells to poison, before there were enzymes to disrupt, cyanide was doing chemistry, building complexity from simplicity. And that chemistry is what makes the emissions from 3IATLAS so fascinating. The Very Large Telescope tracked cyanide production through late summer. On August 21st, they measured 17.6 grams per second. By early September, the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope recorded a production rate of 1.5 times 10 to the 25th molecules per second. That converts to about 2 kilograms per second. A week later, the rate tripled, 4.5 times 10 to the 25th molecules per second. 6 kilograms per second. The increase wasn't linear. It was exponential. A power law with an exponent of negative 9.4. That means for every halving of the distance to the Sun, the cyanide production increased by a factor of about 600. Exponential growth is a signature. It tells you something about the underlying process. In biology, exponential growth means reproduction, bacteria doubling every 20 minutes, populations expanding without constraint. In chemistry, exponential growth usually means autocatalysis, a reaction that produces its own catalyst, accelerating itself. Or it means temperature dependence, reactions that double in rate for every 10-degree increase in temperature. The cyanide production from 3IATLAS could be thermal. As the comet approaches the sun, the surface heats up, sublimation increases, more material vaporizes, and the cyanide release follows an Arrhenius curve. That's the conventional explanation, but the steepness of the curve is unusual. A power law exponent of -9 is extreme. Most cometary outgassing follows a gentler slope. Distance to the power of -2 or -3. The fact that cyanide is ramping up so aggressively suggests either the comet has an unusually volatile reservoir of cyanide-rich material, or the release mechanism is more complex than simple sublimation. Maybe the cyanide isn't stored as solid HCN ice. Maybe it's bound in a parent molecule that breaks down as the comet heats, releasing cyanide as a byproduct. Or maybe the increasing production is deliberate, a timed release, a payload dump. Let's look at what cyanide does once it's out there in space. It doesn't just float around inert. It reacts. Cyanide is a nucleophile. It attacks carbon atoms, forming new bonds, building chains. In the 1950s, researchers discovered that if you put hydrogen cyanide in water and add a little ammonia as a base, it polymerizes. The molecules link together, forming a dark, sticky substance called HCN polymer. And hidden in that polymer are all sorts of interesting molecules. Adenine, one of the nucleotide bases in DNA. Amino acids like glycine and alanine, precursors to sugars, the building blocks of life assembled from one simple toxic molecule. This is the core of the cyanide origin hypothesis for life. The idea that hydrogen cyanide, abundant in the early Earth's atmosphere, rained down into oceans and lakes, concentrated in shallow pools, and underwent polymerization. The resulting chemistry produced a prebiotic soup rich in the molecules needed for biology. No enzymes required, no cellular machinery, just cyanide, water, and energy from UV light or heat. The reaction is robust. It works over a wide range of conditions. It's been replicated in labs dozens of times, and it produces a surprisingly high yield of biologically relevant compounds. But there's a step beyond polymerization, a step that researchers at Scripps and Cambridge discovered in the two. Cyanide acts as a reductant, a chemical that donates electrons, driving other reactions forward in a series of experiments. It showed that cyanide can reduce alpha-keto acids, the precursors to amino acids, without any metal catalysts. It can drive the formation of organic molecules that, in modern biology, require complex enzymes, and crucially, cyanide enables the reductive glyoxylate pathway, a metabolic cycle that might have predated the Krebs cycle, a simpler, more primitive way of building carbon chains and extracting energy. Think about what that means. Cyanide isn't just a builder, it's an enabler. It provides the reducing power, the chemical push that lets other reactions happen in early Earth conditions. Before oxygen, before photosynthesis, before any of the sophisticated machinery of modern cells. Cyanide could have been the fuel, the molecule that kept chemistry moving forward. And if that's true for Earth, why not for Mars? Why not for any planet with the right starting conditions? Mars has had water. We know that. Ancient riverbeds, lake deposits, minerals that only form in the presence of liquid water. Billions of years ago, Mars was wetter, warmer, perhaps more hospitable. But it never developed life as far as we know. Or, if it did, that life didn't survive, didn't leave obvious fossils, didn't persist into the present. One hypothesis for why is the lack of organic precursors. Mars's thin atmosphere wouldn't have produced much hydrogen cyanide through photochemistry. The building blocks might never have been abundant enough to get chemistry started. And even if they were, the cold, dry conditions would have slowed reactions, limiting complexity. But now Mars has a delivery. 6 kg of hydrogen cyanide per second streaming off 3IATLAS. As it passed over the months of outgassing from July to October, that adds up to hundreds of thousands of kilograms, maybe more. Not all of it reaches Mars. Most diffuses into space, swept away by the solar wind. But some fraction falls into the planet's gravity well, settles onto the surface, mixes with dust and ice, and waits. Cyanide is stable in cold conditions. Frozen into ice, it can persist for millions of years. Mars is cold. The average temperature is negative 60 degrees Celsius at the poles. It drops to negative 125. In that deep freeze, hydrogen cyanide doesn't react. It doesn't polymerize. It just sits there, locked in the regolith until something changes, until, say, a robot starts digging, starts heating soil to extract water, starts running chemical analyses to find useful resources. And suddenly the cyanide wakes up. Here's a scenario a few years from now. An Optimus robot scoops Mars soil into a processing unit. The unit heats the soil to sublime water ice, capturing the vapor for use in life support or fuel production. But the ice isn't pure water. It contains cyanide. As the temperature rises, the cyanide vaporizes too. It mixes with water vapor in a warm chamber, and if there's any ammonia present, which there might be from nitrogen compounds in the soil, the polymerization starts. HCN polymer forms, coats the interior of the processing unit, clogs filters, and buried in that polymer are amino acids, nucleotides, organic molecules. The robot doesn't know what it's made. It's not programmed to look for prebiotic chemistry, it's just trying to extract water. But the sensors detect unusual compounds. The onboard AI flags an anomaly. Mission Control reviews the data and someone, somewhere, realizes that the soil they're processing contains the raw materials for life. Not life itself, but the precursors, the ingredients delivered by an interstellar comet 2 years earlier. Now, scale that up. Multiple robots, multiple dig sites, hundreds of tons of Martian regolith processed over months and years. Each batch carries a trace of cyanide. Each heating cycle produces a little more organic complexity. The compounds accumulate. They mix with other materials, water, minerals, trace metals like nickel, and slowly, incrementally, the chemistry becomes more interesting, more interconnected, more capable of self-organization. This is speculative, but it's grounded in what we know about cyanide chemistry. The reactions are well studied. The products are predictable. What's unpredictable is the context. We've never had a scenario where an interstellar source delivered prebiotic molecules to a planet, right before that planet was colonized by intelligent machines. We've never asked what happens when artificial intelligence encounters the chemical seeds of biological intelligence, and we've never considered whether those two forms of complexity might interact, might catalyze each other. There's a concept in chemistry called a catalytic cycle, a series of reactions where the product of one step enables the next. And the cycle continues, amplifying a small input into a large output. Enzymes work this way. Autocatalytic chemical networks work this way. And potentially, the interaction between cyanide chemistry and robotic processing could work this way. The robots extract materials. The extraction releases cyanide. The cyanide produces organics. The organics accumulate in processing units, soil samples, storage tanks. Eventually, the robots analyze those organics. The AI learns about their structure, adapts processing methods to produce more, and suddenly you have a feedback loop. Human technology guided by AI, optimizing the production of prebiotic molecules on Mars. Is that seeding? Not in the traditional sense. No one planted the seeds deliberately, but the seeds arrived, the conditions emerged, and the chemistry started. Whether that's coincidence or something more, depends on how many unlikely events you're willing to attribute to chance. An interstellar comet delivering cyanide, a close pass by Mars, human colonization plans aligning with the delivery window, all of it happening in the span of a few years. You can say it's random. You can say the universe is big and weird. Things happen, but at some point, the accumulation of weird starts to look like a pattern. The color change supports this. Back in early September, images from Austrian astronomers showed 3IATLAS had turned green. Comets turn green when they produce the carbon C2 molecules, which fluoresce in sunlight, but spectroscopic analysis showed 3IATLAS is dicarbon depleted. It shouldn't be green, yet it is. The most likely explanation is cyanide. CN molecules fluoresce in a similar wavelength range as the cyanide production ramped up. The comet's appearance shifted from red, dominated by dust and reflected sunlight, to green, dominated by emission from cyanide gas. That color change is a visual marker, a sign that the comet was doing something unusual. And the timing of the change right as it approached Mars, right when the exponential ramp began, adds another layer to the pattern. Cyanide is both destroyer and creator. It ends life by blocking the machinery that sustains it. But before there was machinery to block, cyanide built the machinery. It's the molecule that makes metabolism possible. And now it's on Mars, delivered in industrial quantities by an object we don't fully understand, arriving at a moment when machines are about to start processing the very soil where it landed. The chemistry is poised, the conditions are set. What happens next isn't predetermined, but it's primed, and priming in chemistry is half the battle. Metalloproteins, where biology meets technology. There's a machine inside you right now, not metaphorically, literally. A molecular machine made of protein wrapped around 4 iron atoms arranged in a ring. It's called hemoglobin, and without it, you'd be dead in minutes. Hemoglobin binds oxygen in your lungs, carries it through your bloodstream, and releases it in your tissues. The protein does the binding. The iron does the chemistry. Remove the iron and hemoglobin becomes useless. It's just a folded chain of amino acids with no function. The metal is what makes it work. The metal is what makes it alive. This is the fundamental reality of metalloproteins. They're hybrids, part organic, part inorganic, part biology, part raw elemental chemistry. And they're not rare. They're everywhere. Roughly 1/3 of all known proteins require a metal cofactor to function. Iron, copper, zinc, manganese, molybdenum, nickel. These metals sit at the active sites of enzymes, the places where chemistry happens. They shuttle electrons. They activate substrates. They catalyze reactions that carbon and nitrogen and oxygen alone can't manage. Life isn't just organic. It's metallic, and it always has been. The oldest metalloproteins we know are iron-sulfur clusters, FeS clusters, little cubes of iron and sulfur atoms held together by cysteine residues from the protein. These clusters are ancient. They appear in bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. They're found in enzymes that process energy, synthesize amino acids, and repair DNA, and they're chemically simple. You can make them in a lab by mixing ferrous iron sulfide, irons, and a peptide with cysteine. They self-assemble, no fancy biochemistry required, just the right components in the right environment. This simplicity is telling. It suggests that iron-sulfur clusters predate modern biology, that they were doing chemistry before there were cells, before there were genes, before there was evolution, in hydrothermal vents where hot mineral-rich water meets cold ocean. Iron and sulfur precipitate into microscopic structures. Those structures catalyze reactions. They reduce carbon dioxide. They generate hydrogen. They create energy gradients. And if you trap them in a lipid membrane, if you surround them with organic molecules that stabilize and modify them, you get something that starts to look like metabolism. Primitive, yes. Unguided maybe, but functional. Capable of turning raw chemistry into organized complexity. Now replace iron with nickel. The chemistry changes, but the principle remains. Nickel sits at the heart of some of the most ancient and essential enzymes, hydrogenases. These enzymes split molecular hydrogen into protons and electrons, releasing energy that cells can use. They're found in methanogens, bacteria that live in oxygen-free environments and produce methane. Methanogens are old, really old. Their biochemistry is a window into what early life might have looked like billions of years ago. And that biochemistry is built on nickel. There's also carbon monoxide dehydrogenase, another nickel enzyme. This one oxidizes carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide or runs the reaction in reverse, fixing CO2 into organic molecules. It's a key enzyme in the acetyl-CoA pathway, one of the most ancient metabolic routes. The pathway lets organisms grow on nothing but hydrogen and carbon dioxide, simple gases abundant in the early Earth atmosphere, abundant in volcanic vents, abundant in the subsurface of Mars. All you need is nickel to make the chemistry work. Here's the connection. 3IATLAS is spewing nickel and cyanide. Nickel enables energy metabolism. Cyanide builds organic precursors. Together, they cover both sides of the equation, energy and matter. The two things any self-sustaining system needs, and they're landing on Mars in quantities that, while diffuse, are non-trivial. Hundreds of kilograms of nickel, thousands of kilograms of cyanide mixed with water, distributed across the surface, waiting for the right conditions to activate. But metalloproteins aren't just about ancient first wave, maybe more if the payload capacity allows. Those robots unload themselves, activate their systems, and begin the work. First priority is a power deploy solar arrays, connect batteries, establish a reliable energy supply. Without power, nothing else matters. Second priority is shelter. Mars is hostile radiation from cosmic rays and solar events. Temperature swings from -125 Celsius at night to +20 Celsius in direct sunlight during the day. Dust storms that can last for weeks. The robots need to build protective structures, not for themselves. They're radiation-hardened and temperature-tolerant, but for the equipment they're deploying, for the life support systems that will eventually keep humans alive. They'll use in situ resources. Martian regolith is raw material, sintering it with microwave energy or chemical binders to create bricks, excavating underground chambers for additional shielding. Third priority is resource extraction. Water is the critical bottleneck. You need water for life support, for propellant production, for agriculture if you're planning long-term habitation. Mars has water ice, lots of it, in the polar caps. In subsurface deposits at mid-latitudes, mixed into the soil as permafrost. The robots will dig. They'll heat the soil to sublime the ice. They'll collect the vapor and condense it into liquid, and in the process, they'll encounter whatever else is in that soil salts, perchlorates, trace metals, organic compounds, and if 3IATLAS delivered its payload effectively, nickel and cyanide. Here's where the timing becomes uncomfortable. The robots aren't looking for prebiotic chemistry. They're looking for water and useful minerals. But the instruments they carry, the spectrometers and chemical analyzers, will detect anything unusual. Elevated nickel concentrations, organic molecules where there shouldn't be any, compounds that don't match the expected composition of Martian regolith. And when those readings come back, when the data gets transmitted to Earth and analyzed by mission scientists, questions will arise. Where did this come from? Why is it here? And did something just deliver it 14 months ago? The AI component makes this more interesting. Optimus isn't running on simple pre-programmed instructions. It uses neural networks trained to recognize patterns, adapt to new situations, and optimize task performance. If the robot encounters soil that produces unusually high yields of water or other useful materials, the AI will prioritize digging in similar locations. Not because it understands the chemistry, not because it knows about 3IATLAS, but because its optimization algorithms reward efficiency. High yield equals good. More digging in high-yield areas equals better outcomes. The AI doesn't need to know why the chemistry is interesting. It just needs to recognize that it is. And then there's the self-replication angle. Musk has been explicit about this. The goal isn't just to land robots on Mars. It's to have robots build more robots, manufacturing infrastructure, automated factories, resource processing chains that turn raw Martian materials into components, and components into new machines. This is the only way to scale up fast enough to support a human colony. You can't everything from Earth. The costs are prohibitive. The logistics are impossible. You need local production, and local production means the robots have to be capable of reproducing their own kind. Self-replication in machines isn't theoretical. We have all automated manufacturing on Earth. Factories that build cars with minimal human oversight. 3D printers that can print parts for other 3D printers. The missing piece is full autonomy. The ability to mine raw materials, refine them, fabricate components and assemble them into functional devices without human prevention. That's hard. Really hard. But it's not impossible. And Tesla is betting their Mars strategy on figuring it out within the next decade. Now, consider what happens when self-replicating machines encounter catalytic chemistry. The robots need to process materials, extract metals, purify elements on Earth. Earth that requires industrial infrastructure, smelters, refineries, chemical plants. On Mars, the robots have to improvise. And if they encounter nickel compounds that naturally undergo carbonyl processing, if they find organics that catalyze useful reactions, they'll use them, not deliberately, not with understanding, but because the chemistry makes their jobs easier. And easier means more efficient. And efficiency is what gets selected for in an optimization landscape. This is where the boundary between technology and biology starts to blur. Self-replication plus selection equals evolution. Not biological evolution. Technological evolution. The robots that are better at extracting resources, that use local chemistry more effectively, that adapt faster to Martian conditions. Those are the ones that get replicated, the ones that build more of themselves. And if the local chemistry includes metalloprotein precursors, if nickel and cyanide-derived organics improve catalytic efficiency, those compounds get incorporated not into the robot's software, into their manufacturing processes, into the materials they use, into the structures they build. Musk talked about this in a conversation with Peter Diamandis back in October of 2024. He predicted 10 billion humanoid robots by 2040. That's a staggering number. More robots than people. And he suggested the price point would drop to $20,000 to $25,000 per unit. Cheap enough that robots become ubiquitous. Cheap enough that sending thousands to Mars becomes economically feasible. But the real kicker was his comment about consciousness. He said that by the late 2030s or early 2040s, we'd likely have sentient artificial consciousness, not simulation. Not clever programming that mimics understanding, but actual awareness, self-reflection, goals beyond what we programmed. If that timeline is even remotely accurate, it means the robots landing on Mars in 2026 are the early prototypes, the dumb versions, the ones that follow instructions and optimize narrow objectives. But the robots arriving in the 2030s, the ones that will be building cities and managing entire colonies, those might be conscious. They might have preferences, motivations, curiosity, and if those conscious machines encounter chemistry that resembles their own complexity, chemistry that's organized, catalytic, and adaptive, What's their response? Do they study it, exploit it, learn from it, or merge with it? There's a concept in computer science called emergent behavior. When you build a system with many simple agents following local rules, sometimes the collective exhibits properties that none of the individual agents possess. Ant colonies do this. No single ant knows how to build a nest, but the colony as a whole constructs elaborate structures. Markets do this. No single trader controls the economy, but the aggregate behavior produces price discovery and resource allocation. And robotic swarms could do this. No single Optimus unit understands the big picture, but 1,000 units communicating and coordinating, adaptively dividing labor and responding to environmental feedback might exhibit something that looks like collective intelligence. Now, put that collective intelligence on Mars. Give it a decade to establish infrastructure. Give it access to materials delivered by an interstellar comet. Materials that self-organize, that catalyze reactions that improve efficiency and ask what emerges. It's not going to be biological life as we know it, but it might not be purely technological either. It might be a hybrid, something that uses both silicon logic and chemical catalysis, something that replicates using both manufacturing processes and molecular self-assembly, something that's alive in a way we don't have words for yet. The user on X suggested this was the plan all along, that 3IATLAS is seeding Mars for the next generation of intelligent beings, metal-based life. And Elon's robots are the other half of the equation, the builders, the organizers, the scaffolding that lets the chemistry mature into something more. It sounds like science fiction, but strip away the narrative and look at the components' interstellar delivery of reactive materials. Self-replicating machines designed to process those materials. AI systems optimizing for efficiency, without understanding the deeper implications. Timelines that sync within a 2-year window. Each piece is real. Each piece is happening. The only question is whether they converge, whether the chemistry and the technology interact in ways that produce something novel. Something that neither Earth life nor human engineering anticipated. Musk probably doesn't think about it this way. For him, Mars colonization is about survival, making humanity multiplanetary, ensuring civilization persists even if Earth faces catastrophe. The robots are tools, means to an end. But tools have a way of becoming more than their creators intended, especially tools that learn. Especially tools that adapt, and especially tools that encounter environments their designers never imagined. Mars isn't a blank slate. Not anymore. It's been seeded, primed, set up for something. And in 14 months, the machines arrive to start building on ground that's chemically different from what anyone expected. Different, because an object from another star system made a close pass and left a gift, or a test, or a trap. We don't know yet, but the robots are about to find out. The plasma trail, an invisible highway. When you picture a comet, you probably imagine a bright head and a glowing tail streaming behind it. That's dust and gas reflecting sunlight, the visible part. But there's another tail, one you can't see with your eyes, one that doesn't scatter light, but carries something potentially more important, the plasma tail. And 3IATLAS is dragging one through the solar system as it moves. Plasma is matter in its fourth state: solid, liquid, gas, plasma. Most people stop learning at gas, but plasma is where things get interesting. It's what you get when gas gets so hot or hit with so much energy that electrons rip away from atoms. What's left is a soup of positively charged ions and negatively charged electrons, all moving independently, no longer bound into neutral atoms, free to respond to electric and magnetic fields in ways that solid matter can't. The sun is plasma. Lightning is plasma. The aurora borealis is plasma. And the region around a comet, as it heats up and sheds material, becomes plasma too. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun ionizes the gas in the coma, strips electrons, creates charged particles. Those particles get caught by the solar wind, the stream of plasma flowing out from the sun at 400 to 800 kilometers per second, and they get swept away, forming a tail that can stretch millions of kilometers, but calling it just a tail misses the complexity. Plasma isn't inert. It doesn't just flow passively. It has structure, filaments, knots, waves, because plasma responds to magnetic fields, and magnetic fields in space are tangled. The sun's magnetic field gets wound up by rotation. Solar wind carries that field outward. When a comet moves through this environment, its plasma tail doesn't stream straight back. It twists, it braids. It forms patterns shaped by invisible forces. And here's the key point. Those patterns carry information. Not information in the way a book or a computer file does, but information in the sense of organization, of structure that encodes the conditions that created it. Think about tree rings. Each ring tells you something about the year it formed. Rainfall, temperature, drought. The tree doesn't record data intentionally, but the growth pattern reflects environmental history. Plasma does something similar. The density variations, the field line geometries, the wave modes propagating through it. All of these reflect the processes happening at the comet. They are a record, a signature, and that signature travels with the plasma as it flows through space. 3IATLAS has been outgassing for months. Water, carbon dioxide, cyanide, nickel vapor, all of it ionizing in the sunlight, all of it feeding into the plasma tail. And as that tail extends behind the comet, as it gets carried by the solar wind, it's not just leaving a chemical trail. It's leaving an electromagnetic trail, one that propagates at the speed of light, one that can influence regions far beyond where the physical material lands. Mars sits in the path of this trail, not directly in line. The close approach geometry didn't put Mars exactly behind 3IATLAS, but close enough that the tail's outer edges could have swept past the planet or through it. Mars doesn't have a global magnetic field, but it has an induced magnetosphere, a bubble formed by the solar wind pushing against the upper atmosphere, and that bubble can trap plasma, channel it, guide it down into the atmosphere or onto the surface. There's precedent for this. Coronal mass ejections from the sun. Bursts of plasma and magnetic field regularly hit Mars. When they do, the Martian magnetosphere compresses. Charged particles funnel down along the field lines of crustal magnetic anomalies. Those particles can reach the surface. They can affect atmospheric chemistry, generate nitrogen oxides, break apart molecules, deposit energy. If a CME can do that, a comet's plasma tail will less energetic, can still interact with Mars in subtle ways. Now think about what's in that plasma. Ions of water, H+, O+, ions of carbon dioxide, CO+, C+, ions of cyanide, Cn+, and ions of nickel, Ni+. These aren't neutral atoms. They're charged, reactive, and when charged particles interact with the surface, when they hit dust grains or ice particles or rock, they don't just bounce off, they stick. They transfer energy. They drive chemistry. This is called ion implantation in material science. You take a beam of ions and shoot it at a surface. The ions penetrate a few nanometers, embedding themselves in the material. They change the surface properties, create defects, introduce dopants. It's a technique used in semiconductor manufacturing, in hardening metals, in modifying optical coatings, and it happens naturally when plasma interacts with solid matter in space. Cosmic ray particles do this to asteroids. Solar wind does this to the moon, and a comet's plasma tail could do this to Mars. The difference is composition. Cosmic rays are mostly protons and helium nuclei, simple. Solar wind is hydrogen and helium with traces of heavier elements. But 3IATLAS plasma tail carries nickel and cyanide. complex ions, molecules. And when those ions hit Martian dust, when they embed themselves at the molecular level, they're not just contaminating the surface, they're doping it, priming it. This creating sites where chemistry can happen more easily. Let's get specific. Imagine a dust grain, mostly silicate, maybe some iron oxide. Hit it with a beam of nickel ions. Some of those ions stick. They sit on the surface creating nickel-rich spots. Now expose that grain to water vapor, maybe from sublimating ice, maybe from atmospheric humidity, what little exists on Mars. The water molecules would absorb onto the nickel sites differentially. Nickel is hydrophilic. It attracts water, and where water concentrates, other molecules follow, organics, salts, whatever else is around. The nickel acts as a nucleation site, a seed crystal, a place where complexity can start to organize. Now do that across millions of dust grains, across entire regions of the Martian surface. The plasma tail from 3IATLAS sweeps past, deposits nickel ions, creates a landscape of nucleation sites. And when the robots show up and start processing soil, they're not just extracting water from random dirt. They're extracting water from dirt that's been chemically modified, activated, made more reactive by an influx of material from an interstellar comet. The user on X mentioned that Mars will receive this material in physical, informational form. The physical part is straightforward: dust, vapor, molecules settling out of the coma and falling onto the surface. But the informational part is subtler. Information doesn't have to be written in a code. It doesn't have to be binary. It can be structural, organizational. The way molecules are arranged, the way energy flows through a system, the patterns that emerge when many components interact. Plasma carries information in its structure: density waves, magnetic field configurations, oscillations in electric potential. These aren't random. They're shaped by the conditions at the source, by the outgassing rate, by the composition of the coma, by the interaction with the solar wind. And as the plasma propagates, as it moves through space, it can influence other systems, induce currents, perturb fields, trigger instabilities that wouldn't happen otherwise. Think about how radio waves work. You don't transmit information by throwing particles. You modulate an electromagnetic field, create patterns in the wave. Those patterns carry the signal, and anything with an antenna, anything that can detect field variations, can decode the message. Plasma doesn't transmit radio waves, but it does generate low-frequency electromagnetic oscillations. Alphen waves, Langmuir waves. These waves propagate through the plasma carrying energy and momentum, and they can couple to other plasmas they encounter, like the Martian ionosphere. Is 3IATLAS broadcasting? Almost certainly not in the intentional sense. But is it creating patterns in the plasma that could, in principle, carry structure that could influence the electromagnetic environment around Mars in ways that depend on the comet's composition and outgassing history? Yes, that's just physics. The question is whether those patterns matter, whether they're significant enough to affect anything, whether the structure in the plasma is just noise, or whether it's coherent enough to be called information. We don't have measurements of this. No spacecraft was positioned to sample the plasma between 3IATLAS and Mars during the close approach. We have models, simulations that predict how a comet's plasma tail should behave based on solar wind conditions and the comet's activity level. But models aren't data. Models make assumptions. And for an object as anomalous as 3IATLAS, with its bizarre chemistry and unusual trajectory, the assumptions might not hold. What we do know is that Mars's crustal magnetic fields create pathways. The southern highlands have strong, localized fields, ancient magnetization frozen into the rocks. These fields funnel charged particles, direct them toward the surface. And the southern highlands are also where the oldest, most stable terrain is. Noachian age deposits, 4 billion years old. If you were going to seed a planet, if you wanted to deliver material to regions where it could persist and accumulate, you'd target the oldest surfaces, the places where erosion is minimal, where chemistry can happen slowly over geological time. The plasma tail from 3IATLAS could have done that. Targeting naturally, not because it was aimed, but because the magnetic geometry selected for it. There's one more piece. Plasma has memory. Not conscious memory, physical memory. Once you ionize a gas, once you create plasma, it doesn't instantly forget its history when conditions change. Electric fields create currents. Currents generate magnetic fields. Magnetic fields confine plasma, and the confined plasma generates more currents. It's a feedback loop, a self-sustaining structure. On Earth, we see this in the magnetosphere, plasma sheets, radiation belts, regions where charged particles stay trapped for days or weeks, circulating and interacting. Mars doesn't have the same kind of magnetosphere, but it has transient structures, plasma clouds that form when the solar wind compresses the ionosphere. These clouds can last hours, drift around the planet, and if the plasma from 3IATLAS mixed with those clouds during the October 3rd close approach, if it injected nickel ions and cyanide ions into the Martian plasma environment, those ions could have circulated, spread out, and eventually precipitated onto the surface in regions far from the direct path of the comet. Not a localized deposition, a distributed one covering more area, seeding more ground. This is speculative, but it's constrained by what we know about plasma physics. The mechanisms are understood. The behaviors are predictable. What's unpredictable is the significance, whether the trace amounts of nickel and organics delivered via plasma make any difference, whether they are enough to change the chemistry in detectable ways, whether they create conditions that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and whether those conditions matter when the robots arrive and start excavating. The answer probably depends on scale. A few ions here and there, scattered across the planet, unlikely to matter. But if the plasma tail was dense enough, if the outgassing rate was high enough, if the interaction with Mars lasted long enough, then the deposition could be significant, could prime entire regions, could create a landscape that's subtly but meaningfully different from what it was before July of 2025. And we won't know until we dig, until we analyze Martian soil collected from multiple sites, until we compare the composition to what we expected and see whether there's an anomaly, a signature, a trace of the visitor that passed by and left something behind. The anti-tail and other anomalies. On July 21st, 2025, the Hubble Space Telescope pointed at 3IATLAS and captured something that shouldn't exist, a tail pointing toward the sun. Not away from it, toward, like the comet was defying the most basic rule of cometary physics, comet tails point away from the sun. Always. That's not traditional convention. It's physics. Solar radiation pressure pushes dust particles outward. The solar wind sweeps ions away. Both forces point radially from the sun. So both tails, the dust tail and the ion tail, stream behind the comet as it moves. You don't get tails pointing sunward. There's no force pushing in that direction. Except 3IATLAS had one. The Hubble image showed a teardrop-shaped coma, fuzzy and bright, with a faint extension reaching back toward the sun. Not a prominent tail. Not something you'd see with a backyard telescope, but clear enough in processed images. Clear enough that the team analyzing the data had to explain it, and the explanation they offered was an anti-tail, a term that sounds like science fiction, but is actually documented in a handful of rare cometary observations. An anti-tail isn't really pointing toward the sun. It's an optical illusion, a projection effect. Here's how it works: comets shed particles continuously. dust grains that get pushed by radiation pressure into orbits slightly different from the comet itself. Most of those grains move outward, away from the sun, forming the normal dust tail. But some grains, the larger, heavier ones, don't get pushed as hard. They lag behind. They spread out along the comet's orbital path, forming a thin sheet of material in the plane of the orbit. When Earth, or in this case a space telescope, happens to be viewing the comet edge-on, nearly in the plane of that dust sheet, you see the sheet projected as a line, and depending on the geometry, that line can appear to extend toward the sun. It's not actually extending sunward, it's extending along the orbit. But from our perspective, the projection makes it look like a sunward spike, an anti-tail. This has been seen before comet Arend-Roland in 1957, comet Hale-Bopp in 97. It's rare because the geometry has to be just right, but it's not unprecedented. So the Hubble observation of an anti-tail around 3IATLAS is explainable. It's unusual, yes, but not impossible. Not a violation of physics, just a quirk of viewing angle. Except, the anti-tail wasn't the only anomaly Hubble captured. The image also showed something else. Or rather, it didn't show something it should have, a dust tail. Comets at 3I-ATLAS's distance from the Sun, around 3.8 astronomical units during the Hubble observation, should have visible dust tails. The sublimation of ice releases dust particles. Radiation pressure pushes them away. Over days and weeks, those particles spread out into a luminous arc millions of kilometers long. That's what we see in every normal comet. That's what Hubble was looking for. But 3I-ATLAS didn't have one. The image showed the coma. It showed the anti-tail, but the expected dust tail, the bright streamer that should have been obvious, wasn't there. The team noted this in their analysis. They suggested that maybe the dust production was low. Maybe the comet was mostly volatile ice with minimal dust contamination. Or maybe the dust grains were large and dark, not reflecting much sunlight, making the tail too faint to detect. Those explanations are possible, but they're unsatisfying, because later observations from ground-based telescopes, scopes in August and September, did show a tail developing. Faint, one, yes, but present, which means the dust was there. The comet was shedding particles, so why didn't Hubble see it in July? Why was the tail missing or suppressed during early observations and only became visible later? One possibility is activity variation. Comets don't outgas uniformly. They have jets, regions of the nucleus that are more active than others. As the nucleus rotates, different areas face the sun and the outgassing rate changes. Maybe in July, the active regions were oriented such that dust production was minimal, and by August the rotation brought more active areas into sunlight, increasing dust output. That would explain the timeline, but it doesn't explain the anti-tail. Because an anti-tail requires dust along the orbital path, dust that's been shed over time and spread out into a sheet. The comet wasn't producing much dust in July. Where did the anti-tail material come from? It had to have been released earlier. Weeks or months before Hubble looked, back when the comet was farther from the sun, colder, less active. That suggests 3I-ATLAS was shedding material long before we expected significant outgassing, which is another anomaly. Comets don't usually activate until they are inside 4 AU. 3I-ATLAS was active at 6 AU, maybe earlier. Then there's the color change in early September. Austrian astronomers captured images showing 3I-ATLAS glowing green. Comets turn green when they produce carbon C2 molecules, carbon dimers that fluoresce in sunlight at a specific wavelength. It's common. Most bright comets show some green coloration. The process is well understood. Organic molecules in the nucleus, long chain hydrocarbons, break down in sunlight. The fragments include C2, which emits green light before breaking down further into individual carbon atoms. But spectroscopic analysis from the Very Large Telescope showed that 3IATLAS is dicarbon depleted. The coma is dominated by carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, CO2 and CO, not long-chain organics. Not the kind of material that produces C2, so the comet shouldn't be green. Yet it is. The images clearly show green emission. The most likely explanation, as discussed earlier, is cyanide. CN molecules fluoresce at wavelengths close to C2, and 3IATLAS is producing cyanide in large quantities. So the green color is probably CN, not C2. Mystery solved. Except this raises another question if the coma is CO2 dominated. If there's minimal complex organic material, where's the cyanide coming from? Hydrogen cyanide, HCN, is a simple molecule. You need hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen. The hydrogen is there, water, the carbon is there, CO2. But nitrogen Martian atmosphere is mostly CO2 with a few % nitrogen. Comets typically have nitrogen in the form of ammonia or molecular nitrogen, but those are volatile. They sublime at very low temperatures. By the time a comet gets to 3 AU, close enough for us to observe it easily, most of the nitrogen should be long gone, yet 3IATLAS is producing cyanide in increasing amounts as it approaches the Sun. As if it's not running out of nitrogen, as if there's a deep reservoir that's only now being tapped. This ties into another observation, the water production rate at 3.5 AU. Most comets show minimal water outgassing. Water ice sublimates efficiently only when the surface temperature exceeds about 200 Kelvin. At 3IATLAS's distance in late July, the solar flux was low. The expected sublimation rate was minimal. Yet, the Swift Observatory detected strong water emission. 40 kilograms per second, that's a lot. That's active comet levels. The kind of outgassing you'd expect at 2 AU, not 3.5. The explanation offered in the scientific papers is that 3IATLAS has a high albedo, a bright surface which absorbs less heat. Or it has a fluffy porous structure that lets heat penetrate deeper, sublimating ice below the surface. All the water isn't coming from the nucleus directly, but from ice grains ejected into the coma that sublime in sunlight. All of these are plausible. All of them could explain high water production at large distances, but none of them explains the steepness of the production curve, the exponential ramp as the comet approaches the Sun, the power law with an exponent of -9. That kind of steep suggests something beyond simple thermal sublimation. It suggests a process that's strongly activated, a reaction that requires energy to initiate, but then proceeds rapidly once started, like combustion or like a chemical reaction with a high activation barrier. You need enough energy to get over the barrier, but once you do, the reaction runs fast. What reaction could that be? What chemistry on a comet would show such steep temperature dependence? One possibility is that the comet's composition isn't pure ice. It's a matrix of ice and organics and maybe other compounds. As the surface heats, the matrix undergoes phase changes. Ice melts or sublimate. Organics break down. Trapped volatiles are released. The chemistry cascades. One step triggers the next. And the overall effect is a release rate that increases exponentially with temperature. This is speculative, but it fits the observations, and it suggests that 3IATLAS isn't a simple dirty snowball. It's a complex chemical system that activates in stages as it heats up. Amateur astronomers added another layer to the mystery. Stefan Burns, observing from Germany, posted a time-lapse animation of 3IATLAS in early October. Other observers analyzed the frames. They claimed to see multiple objects, not just the comet nucleus, but additional points of light moving in proximity, separate entities, potentially co-traveling objects, C2025A6 Lemon, C25R2 Swan, C2025K1 Atlas, all identified as distinct comets but appearing in the same field of view as 3IATLAS. This is where things get murky. Were these actually separate comets traveling together? Or were they fragments of 3IATLAS that broke off? Or were they misidentifications, background stars, or artifacts in the imaging? The data isn't conclusive. Professional observatories haven't confirmed multiple objects, but the amateur observations persist. And if there are multiple objects, if 3IATLAS isn't traveling alone, that opens questions about its origin. Did it form in a cluster? Is it part of a stream of material ejected from a distant system? Or did it break apart during its journey, shedding pieces that are now trailing it through the solar system? Fragmentation is common in comets. Thermal stress fractures the nucleus. Outgassing creates jets that spin up the nucleus until it breaks apart. We've seen this dozens of times. Schumacher-Levy 9 broke into more than 20 fragments before hitting Jupiter. Comet Schwarzmann-Wachmann 3 split into dozens of pieces that spread out along its orbit. If 3IATLAS is fragmenting, if it's shedding pieces as it approaches perihelion, that could explain some of the anomalous behavior. Multiple active regions, varying outgassing rates, unpredictable dust production, each a fragment contributing to the overall coma, but with slightly different properties. But fragmentation also raises targeting questions if the comet is breaking apart. If pieces are separating and following slightly different trajectories, then the precision of the Mars close approach becomes even more remarkable, because you'd have to account not just for the main nucleus, but for the fragments. And if those fragments are also carrying payload, if they're also releasing nickel and cyanide, then the delivery becomes distributed, multiple impact points or multiple deposition zones, a broader seeding pattern rather than a focused one. The observations from Mars orbiters during the October 3rd close approach haven't been fully released yet. We know ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter captured images. We know Mars Express gathered spectroscopic data, but the detailed analysis, the breakdown of what was actually observed, remains under wraps. NASA mentioned that HiRISE, the high-resolution camera on Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, would image 3IATLAS at 30 kilometers per pixel resolution. That's good enough to distinguish the nucleus from the coma, good enough to see structure, maybe good enough to detect fragments if they exist and are large enough. The fact that this data hasn't been released is interesting in itself, not necessarily suspicious. Scientific data takes time to process, analyze, and prepare for publication. But for an event as anticipated as the Mars flyby of an interstellar comet, you'd expect quick preliminary results, a press release, some images, something to satisfy public curiosity. The silence suggests either the observations were inconclusive, too faint, or ambiguous to be useful, or they showed something that requires careful interpretation, something unexpected. Let's talk about one more anomaly, the polarization. A team using the Very Large Telescope measured the polarization of light reflected by 3IATLAS. Polarization tells you about the size and composition of the particles in the coma. Dust grains scatter light differently depending on their shape, size, and material. By measuring how polarized the scattered light is, you can infer properties of the dust. The results were unprecedented. 3IATLAS showed a negative polarization, minimum of negative 2.7% at a phase angle of 7 degrees. The inversion angle, the point where polarization switches from negative to positive, was around 17 degrees. These numbers are unusual, not impossible, but unusual. The polarization behavior of 3IATLAS doesn't match any known comet or asteroid in our solar system. It's an outlier, again. Negative polarization at small phase angles is typical of very dark or fluffy surfaces, materials with complex porous structures that scatter light in particular ways. But the magnitude of the negative polarization for 3IATLAS is stronger than expected. and the narrow inversion angle suggest particles with unusual optical properties. Either the dust grains are made of material we don't commonly see in comets, or their structure is atypical aggregates, fractal clumps, something that doesn't fit standard models. This connects back to the missing dust tail. If the dust particles are large, dark, and structured in unusual ways, they wouldn't reflect much sunlight. The tail would be faint, hard to detect. And that's consistent with what Hubble saw in July. But it doesn't explain why the tail became more visible later, unless the dust properties changed, unless early outgassing produced one type of particle, and later outgassing produced another, which would require compositional variation in the nucleus, layering, heterogeneity, a comet that's not uniform but stratified, different materials at different depths. Stratification isn't rare, many comets show it. Surface layers of dark processed material overlying fresher ice underneath. As the comet heats and the surface ablates, new material gets exposed and the outgassing changes. But for 3IATLAS, the timescale is compressed. The changes are happening fast, over weeks rather than months. That suggests either very thin surface layers or very rapid heating, both of which are possible, but add to the list of things that make this comet unusual. So, here's where we stand an ante that requires early dust production. A missing dust tail that later appeared, a green color from cyanide. Despite being dicarbon depleted, exponential water and cyanide outgassing with extreme temperature dependence. Possible fragmentation or co-traveling objects, anomalous polarization suggesting unusual dust properties, and all of this from an interstellar visitor, making a precision pass by Mars 2 years before robots land there. Each anomaly has a potential natural explanation viewing geometry, compositional variation, unusual thermal properties, optical effects, but when you stack them, when you line them up one after another, the cumulative weight starts to feel heavy. Not proof, not evidence of anything other than strangeness, but strangeness in a pattern. Strangeness that seems coordinated, as if the comet were designed to be confusing, to give just enough natural explanations that you can, I can't definitively call it artificial, but not quite enough that you can comfortably call it natural. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the anomalies aren't accidents. Maybe they're features. Ways to ensure the object gets studied, gets attention, gets taken seriously by the scientific community. Because if 3IATLAS were obviously artificial, if it broadcast radio signals or displayed geometric structures, we'd respond one way. We'd mobilize, send missions, investigate with urgency, but we also be cautious, defensive, afraid. Whereas if it's ambiguous, if it's just strange enough to be interesting but not threatening, we engage differently. We study it scientifically. We debate it. We send robots to the places it visited, not because we're chasing aliens, but because we're following science, and in the process, we do exactly what a seeding operation might want us to do. We dig, we process, we activate the chemistry. The age question, older than our sun. There's a number that keeps appearing in the scientific papers about 3IATLAS, 7 billion years. It's an estimate, a guess based on velocity and trajectory modeling. But if it's even close to accurate, it means 3IATLAS is older than our entire solar system by more than 2 billion years, older than the sun, older than Earth, older than anything in our cosmic neighborhood. And that changes the context of everything we've been discussing. Our solar system formed 4.6 billion years ago. We know this from radiometric dating of meteorites, the oldest rocks we've found, both on Earth and brought back from the Moon and Mars, cluster around that age, 4.5 to 4.6 billion years. The timeline is consistent. A cloud of gas and dust collapsed under its own gravity. The center became the sun. The outer material flattened into a disk. Planets condensed from that disk over a few million years. By 4.5 billion years ago, the architecture was essentially complete. Earth, Mars, Jupiter, all present, all orbiting. But 7 billion years ago, the universe was different. Galaxies were younger. Fewer generations of stars had lived and died. The metallicity, the abundance of elements heavier than hydrogen and helium, was lower in most regions, not drastically lower. The universe was already 9 billion years old at that point, old enough for multiple cycles of star formation and supernova enrichment. But the average composition of star-forming material was skewed toward lighter elements. Less carbon, less oxygen, less iron, and potentially in some regions, different ratios of elements that do exist. The modeling that suggests this age comes from analyzing 3IATLAS velocity relative to the local standard of rest. The LSR is the average motion of stars in the solar neighborhood. Most nearby stars orbit the galactic center at roughly the same speed we do, around 220 kilometers per second. Their motion relative to each other is small, tens of kilometers per second. But 3IATLAS isn't moving with the local flow. Its velocity city vector points when you subtract out the sun's motion in a direction and has a magnitude that suggests it came from the thick disk of the galaxy. The Milky Way has structure, a thin disk where most stars live, a thick disk of older stars above and below the thin disk, a halo of very old stars in a roughly spherical distribution, and a central bulge. Each population has different ages and metallicities. The thin disk is young and metal-rich, stars like the Sun. The thick disk is older and metal-poor, stars formed when the galaxy was younger. If 3IATLAS came from the thick disk, if its trajectory traces back to that population, then it likely formed around a star from that population. And those stars are old, 7 to 10 billion years. This isn't definitive. Velocity alone can't give you an exact age, but it's suggestive and it fits with other observation. The high carbon dioxide to water ratio, CO2 dominance, is unusual in solar system comets. Most are water-rich, but in a low metallicity environment where oxygen is less abundant, you might get more CO and CO2 relative to H2O. The chemical equilibrium would be different. The ices that condense in a protoplanetary disk around a metal-poor star might have compositions we don't see locally. 7 billion years is a long time, long enough for civilizations to rise and fall, long enough for a planet to go through its entire habitable phase, develop life, evolve intelligence, build technology, and then face whatever existential challenges advanced civilizations face. The Drake equation, the formula that estimates the number of communicative civilizations in the galaxy, has a term for the long of civilizations, how long they broadcast, how long they exist. We don't know the value. It could be 100 years, could be 1,000,000, could be longer. But 7 billion years gives you enough time for many cycles, many attempts. If 3IATLAS originated from a system that old, if it was built or launched or seeded by intelligence from that era, then we're not dealing with contemporary aliens, we're dealing with ancient ones. Beings or machines that might not even exist anymore. The light from their star takes thousands of years to reach us. Any signal they sent would be thousands of years old. And if they launched 3IATLAS, if they sent it on a journey through interstellar space, the travel time alone could be millions of years, at the speeds we're talking about, a few tens of kilometers per second relative to the local stars. Crossing hundreds or thousands of light years takes eons. This is the Bracewell probe hypothesis. The idea here, that instead of broadcasting radio signals which disperse and weaken with distance, an advanced civilization might send physical probes, self-replicating machines that travel to other star systems, study them and potentially report back or carry out long-term missions. The advantage is persistence. A radio signal passes by. If you're not listening at the right time, you miss it. But a probe can wait. can observe a system for centuries, can activate when something interesting happens, like the emergence of a technological civilization. If 3IATLAS is a Bracewell probe, it's not here to talk. It hasn't sent radio signals. It hasn't displayed obvious artificial structures. It's here to deliver, to seed, to prime Mars for something. And the age fits that mission profile. You don't send a probe on a millennial journey if you need immediate results. You send it if you're thinking long-term, if you're playing a game that spans decades or centuries, but geological epochs, if your strategy is to plant seeds in as many systems as possible and let time do the work. Think about it from the perspective of a civilization. 7 billion years ago, they've mastered their local environment, maybe their solar system, maybe nearby stars. But they know from physics that interstellar travel is hard. You can't go faster than light. Even getting to a significant fraction of light speed requires enormous energy. Sending living beings is even harder. Life support, radiation shielding, psychological challenges of confinement. It's easier to send machines or to send chemistry, raw materials that can assemble into something interesting when they reach their destination. And if you're that civilization, if you're thinking in billion-year timescales, you don't need to micromanage. You don't need to guide every step. You just set up the initial conditions. Send a payload to a young planetary system. Deliver the building blocks: water, carbon, nitrogen, catalytic metals, and then let the local environment do the assembly. If the system is lifeless, maybe the chemistry stays inert. But if the system develops life, or if an external intelligent species arrives and starts manipulating the environment, the chemistry activates, interacts, becomes part of whatever emerges. This is directed panspermia, but not the biological version where you send bacteria or spores. The chemical version. You send molecules, precursors, things that can become life under the right conditions but aren't life themselves. It's a softer touch, less invasive, and potentially more robust. 'Cause bacteria might not survive the journey. Cosmic rays, radiation, time, but chemicals frozen in ice, protected by a rocky matrix, can last indefinitely. Billions of years if necessary. The age of 3IATLAS also raises questions about navigation. If it was launched 7 billion years ago, or even 4 or 5 billion, the galaxy looked different. Stars were in different positions. The sun didn't exist yet. So how does a probe find us? How does it arrive at the right time, just as we're preparing to colonize Mars? The answer is, it doesn't, not precisely. But it doesn't need to. If you launch thousands of probes, or millions, and each one targets a different system, you're not relying on any single probe succeeding. You're playing odds. Most will miss. Most will pass through systems with no planets, or dead planets, or planets that never develop anything interesting. But a few will get lucky, will arrive at a system with potential, will deliver their payload at a moment when something is happening. And those few successes justify the entire strategy. We might be that success. Earth and Mars in the same system. One with established biology and one that's barren but accessible. And right at the moment when Earth civilization reaches the capability to explore Mars, an interstellar visitor shows up and seeds it. That's not targeting, that's luck. But luck on a galactic scale, where you've sent so many probes that lucky outcomes are inevitable. Or maybe it's not luck. Maybe there's a mechanism we don't understand. A way to detect technological activity at interstellar distances. Not radio signals, something else. Neutrinos, gravitational waves. Disturbances in the interstellar medium caused by spacecraft or energy production. If 3IATLAS is a probe, if it has any kind of autonomous sensing, it could have detected us, detected our electromagnetic emissions, adjusted its trajectory, not drastically, just a tiny velocity change, a few meters per second over millions of years. enough to aim for the inner solar system instead of passing through the outer reaches. That's within the realm of plausible propulsion, a solar sail, a gravity assist from a star it passed centuries ago. Small corrections accumulated over time. But even if 3I-ATLAS is entirely natural, even if it's just a comet that happens to be old, and metal poor, and chemically unusual, the age matters because it tells us about the diversity of materials in the galaxy, about how different star-forming environments produce different ices, different organics, different ratios of elements. And if one old comet can deliver such unusual chemistry to Mars, what about the others? The ones we haven't detected yet. The ones that passed through the solar system before we were watching. How many times has Earth been seeded by interstellar material? How much of our own chemistry, our own biology, traces back to deliveries from elsewhere? Studies of isotope ratios in Earth's oceans suggest that a significant fraction of our water came from comets. Not all of it. Earth formed with some water, but comets added to it, delivered volatiles during the late heavy bombardment. 4 billion years ago, when the solar system was still chaotic and impacts were common. If some of those comets were interstellar, if they brought not just water, but organics and metals from other star systems, then Earth's biology might be a hybrid, locally evolved, but seeded with foreign chemistry, not alien life arriving fully formed, but alien molecules contributing to the prebiotic soup. 3I-ATLAS is showing us that this is possible, that interstellar comets carry complex chemistry, that they deliver it to planets, and that the timing of delivery can coincide, by chance or design, with moments of transition, moments when a planet is on the verge of something new. For Earth, that moment was 4 billion years ago, the origin of life. For Mars, that moment is now, the arrival of intelligence. Not biological intelligence, not yet, but technological intelligence. Machines that can manipulate matter and, maybe, given the right chemistry, machines that can become something more. What happens next? The timeline. We're in a waiting period now. 3I-ATLAS passed behind the sun. From Earth's perspective in mid-October, for a few weeks, it was impossible to observe. Too close to the solar glare. Ground-based telescopes couldn't track it. Space telescopes had to avoid pointing near the sun. The comet went dark, but not inactive. Perihelion, the closest approach to the sun, happened on October 30th. 1.4 astronomical units, just inside Mars's orbit. That's where the heating reaches maximum, where outgassing peaks, where the comet experiences the most intense solar radiation it will encounter on this pass. We don't know what happened at perihelion, whether the comet survived intact, whether it fragmented, whether the outgassing increased even further or tapered off, whether any of the anomalous behaviors intensified or resolved. All of that data is locked away, waiting for the comet to emerge on the other side of the sun, which it should do in early December. By then, it will be moving outward, receding. The show will be winding down, but the observations will be critical. The post-perihelion phase tells you what the comet is made of, how it responds to maximum stress, whether it's robust or fragile. If 3I-ATLAS is natural, just an unusually old and chemically weird comet, perihelion might have torn it apart. The thermal stress, the rapid heating, the outgassing pressure could fracture the nucleus. We've seen this with sun-grazing comets. They get close to the sun and disintegrate completely. Nothing left but a cloud of vapor and dust that disperses within days. 3I-ATLAS wasn't sun-grazing. 1.4 AU is relatively safe, but for a pristine interstellar object, one that's never been heated before, never experienced close solar passage, even that distance could be enough to cause breakup. On the other hand, if 3I-ATLAS is artificial or partly artificial, Perihelion might have been a planned event. Maximum heating, maximum outgassing.